In the forgotten corners of Asia, where whispers outlive names, some stories were never meant to be told. Welcome to Folklore, the channel where ancient rituals, cursed traditions, and ancestral spirits come back to life, one tale at a time. Tonight, we return to a quiet Japanese village, swallowed by mist, haunted by memory. A place where childless families once shaped clay dolls from river mud and ashes, and waited in silence for something to breathe. But when the past is buried in dirt, something always finds a way to rise.
The first thing Ayaka noticed was how quiet the village was. Not peaceful, not serene, just quiet. A kind of silence that felt pressed into the soil, like something long buried and still watching. As the car creaked down the narrow gravel path into Tsugino, she rolled down her window, half expecting to hear the distant hum of cicadas or the chatter of old farmers. But there was nothing. Just wind brushing through rice stalks, like fingers dragging across a drum. Hiroshi, her husband, didn't say much during the drive. He hadn't said much since they left the city, really. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but not like a man watching traffic, more like someone returning to a place they never wanted to see again. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper, almost to himself. It hasn't changed. Ayaka looked around. She had never been to Tsugino before, only heard stories of it, an ancestral home tucked deep into the folds of Honshu's western valleys, untouched by time and ignored by maps. The homes were old and sagging, their wooden beams warped by decades of rain and fog. The rice fields stretched endlessly, each one reflecting the gray sky like 1,000 broken mirrors. The car stopped in front of a house that seemed more like a shadow than a building. Dark wood, black tile roof, the entrance hidden behind a veil of weeping bamboo. Hiroshi stepped out without waiting for her. His footsteps crunched softly over the gravel as he approached the sliding door. It creaked open like an exhale. The smell hit her instantly. Damp earth, old incense, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. Inside, the house was larger than it looked. Tatami mats stretched across the floor, stained with age. Cobwebs hung like funeral threads in the corners. There was a Kamidona shrine on the far wall, its miniature torii gate cracked, the offerings bowl empty. Ayaka lingered near the doorway, feeling the chill climb up her arms. "Do people still live here?" she asked. "No one's been here since my grandmother died, but someone comes to clean, sometimes." She doubted it. Dust coated everything in a thick, patient layer, like the house had been waiting to be forgotten. That night, after they unpacked the bare essentials, Ayaka stood by the bedroom window and looked out over the rice fields. The moon was low, heavy, and the wind had stilled. She could see the path that led from the edge of the property down into the fields, narrow, sunken, and lined with stone markers worn smooth by time. One of them, taller than the rest, seemed to tilt toward the house, like it was listening. Hiroshi stood behind her. "That's where it happened," he said quietly. She turned. "Where what happened?" He shook his head. "Nothing." Later, while he slept beside her, Ayaka lay awake and listened to the house breathe. The wooden beams creaked gently, expanding and contracting like ribs in the dark. She tried to blame it on the age of the place, but the sound was too steady, too alive. At some point, she dozed off, only to be jolted awake by a sound she couldn't quite place, a wet shuffle, like something heavy being dragged across tatami. She sat up. The room was still. She reached over to touch Hiroshi's hand. It was cold. He didn't stir. In the morning, she found muddy footprints by the front door, small ones like a child's, but there had been no rain and no one had visited. When she asked Hiroshi about them, he just stared out at the rice fields and said, "Sometimes things return before we call them."
Ayaka had never thought silence could carry so much weight, but in the Shiba ancestral home, even her own footsteps seemed too loud. On the second day, she explored more of the house, while Hiroshi remained oddly detached. He claimed he had work emails to catch up on, though she didn't remember seeing him bring his laptop. He sat on the Angawa, that wooden corridor overlooking the fields, staring at nothing in particular, as if waiting for something to emerge from the mist. Ayaka moved from room to room, dusting with a cloth that grew black and heavy within minutes. Most of the doors stuck. Some refused to open at all. But the rooms she could enter offered strange glimpses into a life long abandoned. Faded photographs of children who didn't smile, shelves lined with broken teacups, and a rocking chair that seemed freshly used, though no one had touched it in years. In what looked like an old guest room, tucked behind a sliding Fusuma panel, she found it. A cradle. Small, wooden, unpainted, but built with precision like someone had crafted it with care and purpose. It was so out of place in a home that had long stopped echoing with any child's laughter. She approached slowly. The cradle was empty except for a folded piece of cloth, yellowed with age and smelling faintly of ash. She picked it up and unfolded it. Inside was a single lock of hair, gray, brittle, bound with a red thread. Her fingers trembled. She didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't a memento, but an offering. She placed it back carefully, not wanting to disturb whatever memory had been left there. That night, while Hiroshi sat outside again, she decided to climb into the attic. He didn't stop her. He didn't even look at her. The ladder groaned as she ascended. The attic smelled like mold and secrets, dry wood, old kimono fabric, and beneath it all, a strange warmth that didn't belong in such a dead place. There wasn't much. Boxes of incense sticks, shredded paper charms, a broken mirror. And then, in the far corner, almost hidden beneath a loose tatami tile, she found it. A cradle. Small, wooden, unpainted, but built with precision, like someone had crafted it with care and purpose. It was so out of place in a home that had long stopped echoing with any child's laughter. She approached slowly. The cradle was empty except for a basin, round, wide, made of river clay, with cracks crawling up its sides like veins. But it was the color that caught her breath, not the dull gray she expected, but something darker. The inside was stained black, as if something had burned there a long time ago. And when she reached out to touch the rim, she recoiled. It was warm. Not room temperature. Warm. Like someone had just used it. Ayaka backed away, heart racing. The attic suddenly felt smaller, the shadows thicker. She stumbled down the ladder, nearly falling, and rushed into the hallway. Hiroshi was standing there. He hadn't been moments ago. "Did you find something?" he asked, his voice too calm. Ayaka tried to steady herself. "Just old junk, some burned clay basin upstairs. It's still warm." His eyes narrowed. For a moment, his lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he blinked, and something in him shifted. "Don't go back up there. That belonged to my great-grandmother. She used it to dye cloth. It's just soot." But Ayaka had dyed cloth before. Clay basins didn't hold heat for 40 years, and soot didn't smell like bone. She nodded anyway. That night, Hiroshi didn't come to bed. Ayaka waited, listening for the door, but it never opened.
She got up once and checked the hallway. Empty. The front door was unlocked, swinging slightly in the breeze. The wind carried a faint sound through it, the rustling of water or whispering in a tongue she couldn't place. She went to the engawa and looked out. Down by the edge of the rice fields, under the pale moon, Hiroshi stood barefoot in the mud. His head was bowed, his lips were moving. There was no one there, but he was speaking like there was. And when she called out to him, he didn't answer. He didn't even look up. Ayaka awoke just before dawn, her body drenched in a cold sweat. She didn't remember falling asleep. All she remembered was the sound, low and wet, like clay being stirred by hand in a deep bowl. The sound had crept through her dreams, curling around her thoughts like a vine, dragging her deeper and deeper until she was no longer sure whether she was sleeping or sinking. She sat up, heart thudding. The bedroom was still, but the air felt heavy, moist. A strange scent lingered, not foul, not exactly, but earthy, like fresh mud mixed with something older, more human. She looked toward the door. It was open. She clearly remembered closing it the night before, locking it, in fact. Ever since she found that basin, she had begun locking everything, not out of fear, she told herself, but out of habit. Old houses creaked, doors shifted. But this wasn't a shift, it was a deliberate opening. She stepped into the hallway barefoot. The tatami mat was damp beneath her toes. A chill crawled up her spine. The house was quiet. Not the usual silence of a rural home. This was deeper. Like the whole place had exhaled and hadn't inhaled since. The walls seemed to press in slightly, swollen with moisture. She touched the paper panel of the fusuma beside her. It was soft, sagging in the middle, as if something had breathed on it from the other side. Then she saw it. A streak of wet clay on the floorboards, leading away from the kitchen. She followed it. It curved gently, disappearing into the shadows of the hall. Her breath caught as she saw it split, one trail going into the room with the cradle, the other toward the kamigana. The shrine was dimly lit by the faintest moonlight filtering through the paper screen. Ayaka crept toward it. The small altar looked as it had before. The incense bowl, the cracked mirror, the miniature torii gate. But now, something new sat in front of it. A small doll, made of clay. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. The doll was shaped like a child, maybe 2 or 3 years old in form, with stubby limbs and a round head. But its features weren't finished. Its eyes were mere hollows, its mouth a thin crack in the clay. Yet somehow, it was familiar. Ayaka stepped back. Behind her, the floor creaked. She turned. No one was there. But when she turned back to the shrine, the doll was gone. She gasped, stumbling backward into the hallway. Her foot slid on something slick, and she caught herself just before hitting the floor. When she looked down, her palm was smeared in dark mud. A faint giggle echoed from the walls, not loud, almost too quiet to notice. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, Hiroshi returned to the house as if nothing had happened. His feet were clean, his clothes dry. He brought in a bundle of vegetables from somewhere, humming softly, an old folk tune she didn't recognize. Ayaka watched him move, wondering how he could hum when the house felt so full of eyes. She told him about the footprints, the clay doll, the giggle. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This place is old," he said. "It plays tricks on you." Ayaka wanted to scream. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him, make him listen. But there was something in his voice that warned her to stay silent. That night, she locked every door again. She sprinkled salt at the windows, a trick her grandmother once taught her. And she placed the cradle upside down. She lay in bed, wide awake, listening. The house breathed again. The walls creaked, not from wind, but rhythmically, like lungs. Inhale, exhale. And then, from the corner of the room, she heard a whisper. "Oka-san." The voice was high, young, innocent, but it did not belong to anything alive.
Ayaka didn't tell Hiroshi what she heard that night. She wanted to. She opened her mouth at breakfast, spooning rice into her bowl with trembling fingers, trying to find the words. But when she looked at him, she saw someone she didn't quite recognize. His hands moved just a little too slowly. His eyes lingered on the wall just a little too long, and his lips, while chewing, were whispering something. Not to her, to someone else. So she said nothing, just nodded, smiled, and cleared the dishes like any obedient wife from an old story. But in her chest, something was twisting. Not just fear, grief. A slow mourning for the man sitting across from her who still wore her husband's face. Later that day, she returned to the attic. The basin was still there, still warm, still heavy with something unseen. She stared into it for a long time, wondering if heat could linger for decades, wondering if ghosts carried body heat. The air around it buzzed, not loud, but constant, like flies without wings. Beside the basin, tucked beneath a rotting prayer scroll, she found a bundle of old paper, ink faded, water damaged, but still legible. Written in a woman's hand, gentle strokes, deliberate kanji. It was a ritual, a step-by-step guide, not for a festival, not for a blessing, but for something older, something darker, something called the Sosen Katachi no Gi, the shaping of the ancestor. The ink trembled beneath her fingers as she read. When the bloodline is broken, when no seed bears fruit, the river shall provide what the body cannot. Gather clay from the stream where ancestors were burned. Mix it with ashes from the funeral pyre. Shape the lost heir from your own hands. Leave it in the marriage bed for 7 nights, unwashed and unbothered. On the 8th morning, if the soul has returned, it shall draw breath in silence. There were warnings too. If the shape is wrong, the spirit will not rest. If the name is spoken too soon, it will cling to the living. If you reject it, it will not forget. Ayaka's breath caught in her throat. She stared at her fingers, slim, strong, sculptor's fingers. She'd always loved working with clay, even as a child. But this wasn't art. This was desperation with rules. She descended the ladder slowly, clutching the pages to her chest. Hiroshi wasn't home when she went back downstairs. Again, no explanation, no message, just gone. So she waited until the sky turned gold, then blue, then black. She opened the back door and stepped barefoot into the cold dirt behind the house. The stream was still there, barely a trickle now, but enough. The earth beside it was soft. She dug with her hands. The clay was rich, dark, and slick. It smelled faintly of smoke. She brought it inside and placed it in a bowl. Then she walked to the kamidana, lit incense, whispered a prayer she didn't quite believe, and opened the urn she had never dared to touch. Inside,
were the ashes of Hiroshi's great-grandmother, or so the label claimed, but Ayaka knew better. The ashes were still warm. She mixed them, clay and ash and grief. She kneaded it until her arms burned, until her breath grew shallow, until the mass became pliable and heavy in her lap. Then, in the middle of their bedroom, she began to shape. It started with a torso, round, childlike. Limbs followed, too thin. She broke them and reshaped, again and again, like muscle memory, like something inside her already knew the form. She didn't give it a face, not yet. The ritual was clear. Let the soul choose its own reflection. When it was done, she wrapped it in an old cloth and laid it gently on the bed beside her. She didn't tell Hiroshi when he came home. He didn't ask. That night, she lay still in the dark, heart pounding. The house said nothing, but the bed whispered.
The figure lay beside her in bed, like a secret she hadn't meant to keep. Small, smooth, child-sized. It didn't look like much, just clay and ash and cloth, shaped with trembling hands in the quiet ache of night. But to Ayaka, it radiated something heavier than its weight, something that pulled her breath tight, like standing too close to a fire that wasn't burning. She didn't sleep. She turned to her side, careful not to disturb the figure. The room had never felt so still, not quiet, still, as if the air itself was listening. Outside, wind pressed gently against the shoji screen. A branch scratched across it in long, slow drags. Somewhere in the distance, a frog croaked once, then nothing. Ayaka closed her eyes. She opened them seconds later. She wasn't sure what had woken her. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was the faint sound of something shifting, the rustle of fabric, the wet press of weight into the mattress. She didn't move, just listened. The figure had been wrapped in a cloth, but now she could hear clay brushing against cotton, a subtle, moist sound, as if the shape had softened. She turned her head. The figure had moved. It was lying closer now, just a few inches more. Its arms, once folded neatly against its sides, were now slightly bent, reaching, were stretching. She couldn't tell in the dark. Ayaka sat up slowly, heart slamming against her ribs. She reached out and touched it with one finger. Warm. Not body warm. Not room temperature. Warm like something alive, like breath had passed through it. She jerked her hand back. The clay stuck slightly to her fingertip, slick and wet, as if the thing had just been shaped moments ago. But she had finished it hours earlier. She had watched it dry. She had made sure. She stood, wrapped herself in her robe, and went to the bathroom to wash her hands. As she scrubbed the clay off her skin, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror. But the face staring back at her wasn't hers. It was her, but tired, aged, and behind her, in the reflection only, the figure sat upright on the bed. She turned in panic. The bed was empty. The clay shape lay still in the exact position she had left it. Had she imagined it? The warmth? The shift? She didn't go back to bed. Instead, she sat on the floor watching it through the dim light of the hallway. At sunrise, Hiroshi walked into the room as if he hadn't noticed she had been gone all night. His expression was calm, but his eyes were distant, as if they weren't looking at her, but through her, like he was listening to something else entirely. He glanced at the clay figure without surprise, no questions, no confusion. "You made it," he said. His voice was soft, almost reverent. Ayaka's mouth dried. "How do you know what it is?" He didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, he whispered,
My grandmother made one too, when my grandfather died and she was barren. She didn't talk about it, but sometimes I'd hear her praying at night, praying for it to stop breathing. Ayaka stared at him. You said it was for dyeing cloth. Hiroshi finally looked at her, and for a moment she saw it again, the flicker in his expression, something else behind the eyes, something younger, something curious. He said, I didn't lie. That's what they told me. He walked past her and into the hallway. As he disappeared around the corner, she heard him speak again, but not to her. You came back, didn't you? His voice was quiet. But from somewhere inside the walls, a second voice answered, not loud, not sharp, just wet, gurgling, and almost delighted. That night, when Ayaka tried to move the figure from the bed, it clung to the sheets. Literally. Its clay had softened again, fused slightly with the fabric beneath it. She had to peel it off gently, and as she did, she thought she felt something shift inside, something resisting. She set it on a small table across the room, careful not to look at it too long. She lay in bed again, this time alone, and still, it whispered.
Ayaka didn't expect it to survive the first night. She thought, perhaps naively, that the clay would dry, crack, and crumble under its own weight, that the ritual was nothing more than folklore, a sorrowful tradition born from grief, too ancient to still breathe. But when the second night came, the figure was softer. She hadn't watered it, she hadn't touched it, yet the clay felt newly pressed, as though someone had been sculpting it again with warm fingers. By the third night, the shape had begun to change, subtly. Its arms, once rounded stubs, had gained definition, the curve of a wrist, the hint of fingers. Its chest rose slightly now, as if filled with breath, or something pretending to be breath. Ayaka told herself it was only gravity, only moisture from the air, only tricks of the mind and sleepless nights. But then came the fourth. She awoke to the sound of fabric tearing. The figure had moved again, not far, but enough to pull the sheet under it taut, twisting the cloth around one clay foot that hadn't been there before. She reached out to fix it, and for a moment she felt it pulse. Just once. A slow, deliberate throb beneath the surface, like a heartbeat formed in silence. She didn't scream. She just pulled her hand back and whispered the only thing that came to mind. I didn't mean to. The fifth night, Hiroshi stood by the rice fields again, barefoot in the cold. She watched him from the Engawa, clutching a cup of tea gone cold, wondering if he even felt the wind anymore. He was talking, mouth moving, head tilted slightly toward the earth, but Ayaka couldn't hear what he said. Only the wind replied, brushing across the water, bending the rice stalks in a wave around him. He didn't come inside until just before dawn. He smelled of river mud and something else, something metallic, like blood, like coins left in water too long. The sixth night, Ayaka tried to move the figure into the guest room. She needed distance. Her body ached from the tension of sharing a bed with something that never slept. But when she reached for it, it was heavier, much heavier, too heavy for its size, as if something inside the clay had gained weight, had settled. She dragged it across the floor on a folded blanket, each inch leaving behind a smear of dark, wet mud. When she finally got it to the guest room, she placed it gently on the futon and shut the door. She locked it. She even taped the seam of the door with salt and rice paper.
But in the middle of the night, the smell woke her. Wet earth, burned wood, and something sweet and rotting, like spoiled milk mixed with incense. She got up and opened the bedroom door. The guest room was empty. She turned back slowly and saw the clay figure sitting on the edge of her bed. It had no eyes, but somehow it was looking at her. The seventh night, she didn't try to move it. She simply lay down beside it again, not sleeping, not blinking, just breathing through the fear that curled around her chest like vines through a cracked foundation. The figure's shape was fuller now, the body of a toddler, rounded belly, arms bent gently at the elbows, knees drawn in as if curled in rest. Still no face, but Ayaka swore when the candle flickered that she saw the faintest indent where a mouth might form, just a hint, and it was smiling. When Hiroshi entered the room that morning, he didn't react. He looked at the clay figure, then at Ayaka. Then he said, "You're almost there." His voice was different. It didn't belong to him anymore.
On the morning of the 8th day, Ayaka woke to silence that didn't belong to the living. The figure no longer felt like clay. It was still damp, still cold to the touch, but its body had weight. It no longer sagged into itself like a sculpture softening with moisture. It held shape. It possessed balance. It curled beneath the covers like a child, like a thing that had once been formless and now had presence. She didn't remember falling asleep the night before, but she remembered the dream. In it, she was standing in the middle of the rice field, alone, the stalks rotting and slick with ash. The sky was pulsing black and red like an infected wound. Around her ankles, mud whispered in tongues too old for human breath, and from the ground, something rose, not with violence, not with sound, but with inevitability. A small hand reached through the water. She tried to run, but her body was no longer hers. She felt the hand touch her abdomen and breathe. When she opened her eyes, she was crying. She turned her head slowly, dread nesting at the base of her skull like a worm beneath skin. The figure was gone. Not shattered, not displaced. Gone. The blanket was still damp. The spot where it had lain was still pressed. She reached out and touched it. It was warm. She sat up, heartbeat stuttering in her ears, and scanned the room. Her gaze landed on the corner, near the altar. It stood there, the clay child. Not lying, standing. The limbs were uneven, the proportions wrong, but it stood, impossibly balanced on small, damp feet. Its head was tilted slightly, as if listening, and though it still had no eyes, Ayaka could feel its gaze pressing into her, like fingers across her face. She didn't scream. Something in her knew that screaming would make it real, that to acknowledge it fully, with fear, would open a door that might never close. So she stood, knees trembling, and whispered its name. Except she didn't have one. She had never given it a name. But something answered anyway. A sound, a slow, wet inhale, like lungs filling with breath for the first time. The clay body shifted. Its chest rose, then fell, and then it giggled. Not loudly, not playfully, a small, bubbling sound, like air escaping wet earth, a sound that was not meant for joy. It came behind its mouthless face, leaking through a crack forming where lips might be. Ayaka stumbled back. The figure turned its body toward her, slow,
unsure but deliberate. Its legs moved as if trying to remember how to walk. She bumped into the futon and fell backward. When she looked up again, it had stopped. It was closer now, only a few feet away. She crawled backward on the floor, heart beating like thunder inside her chest. "Hiroshi!" she screamed, but the house gave no answer. She stood and bolted for the hallway, feet slipping on the damp wood, and found the door to the Engawa flung wide open. Cold wind poured in, thick with the scent of rain and scorched earth. She ran outside, breath steaming in the morning air. Hiroshi stood in the middle of the field, barefoot, smiling, and he wasn't alone. Beside him, crouching low in the mud, was the same clay figure she had left inside moments ago. But this one was older, taller, its body fuller, more human, more grotesque in its mimicry of a child. It turned toward her. No eyes, no mouth, but it spoke, with Hiroshi voice. "We're all together now." She backed away, choking on her own breath. Her mind begged for reason, for logic, for waking, but nothing came. Only Hiroshi, walking toward her now, arms open, mud dripping from his sleeves like sweat. And beside him, 2 sets of footsteps.
Ayaka didn't remember how she got back inside. Her mind had become a blur of wet footsteps, murmured names, and the sharp sting of wind cutting through her lungs. She only remembered the door slamming shut behind her back pressed to it, and the cold sweat that drenched her skin like river water. She couldn't hear anything now. No laughter, no voice, no footsteps in the field. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was waiting. She crept back through the house like a stranger, checking each room, whispering Hiroshi's name as if she still believed he would answer like he used to. But when she found him, she knew that part of him was already gone. He was sitting in the dark in the old family room, knees drawn to his chest like a boy, rocking slowly. He looked up at her. His face was pale, lips cracked, but he smiled like a child seeing his mother after a nightmare. "He wants to learn," Hiroshi whispered. "He doesn't know what to be yet." Ayaka stood frozen. "Who?" Hiroshi tilted his head. "You know who." She wanted to scream. Instead, she stepped forward, her fingers clenched so tightly they ached. "There's nothing alive in that thing," she said. At first, he said nothing. Then, softly, Hiroshi leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. And the second voice spoke. It came from him, but not through his mouth. It vibrated inside the room, low and gurgling. Not from his throat, not from his chest. It sounded as if it were echoing through the hollows of clay. "We came because you shaped the door," it said. Ayaka backed away slowly, heart thrashing. "You're not him." Both voices, Hiroshi's and the thing's, spoke together this time. "We are what's left when you beg the river to remember." She turned and ran. She didn't look back. She locked herself in the bedroom and shoved a wooden cabinet in front of the door. She sat in the corner with a blanket wrapped around her like armor, listening to every creak of the house, every breath of the wind. The sun rose again, but the light didn't feel warm anymore. Later that day, she found muddy footprints on the tatami in the hallway. They were small, child-sized, and they circled the bedroom door again and again in a strange spiral, like a child had been walking in confusion or ritual. She cleaned them with shaking hands, but they kept coming back. She stopped sleeping. Instead, she watched Hiroshi from the shadows. He no longer ate, no longer bathed. He spoke constantly, to himself, to the walls, to the rice fields. Sometimes he laughed, but the laugh was high and strange and never matched the movement of his mouth. And then one night, Ayaka heard it clearly for the first time. Two voices speaking from one body. One was Hiroshi, soft, calm. The other was the child, wet, ancient, curious. It mimicked his words, repeated them as if learning speech by imitation. But sometimes, just sometimes, it said things first, and Hiroshi followed, as if the voice was no longer learning, but teaching. Ayaka stopped calling him Hiroshi. It was easier that way. Easier to believe he was someone or something else entirely. The man who once held her hand through fertility appointments, who cried in the bathroom when the second test came back negative, who promised her they could be happy even without a child, he was no longer inside the house. Only the shell remained, and whatever shared it was growing stronger. She spent her days in silence, moving through the house like a ghost, avoiding the places she used to love, the garden, the Angawa, the small corner where sunlight used to warm her sketchbooks. Those spaces no longer belonged to her. They belonged to them. One afternoon, while digging through an old drawer in the storage room, she found a stack of family photographs. Most were too faded to make out. Black and white portraits of stern men and thin-lipped women staring straight into the camera. All of them wearing the same expression, blank, heavy, bound by something unspoken. She flipped through them absent-mindedly until one caught her breath. It wasn't the image that stopped her. It was the name scrawled on the back in old kanji. Kazuo Shiba. She recognized it. The name had been scribbled in the margins of the ritual paper she found in the attic, a note beside the instructions. Kazuo, no heir, buried, incomplete, awaiting return. Ayaka stared at the photograph. The man in the image was young, perhaps in his 30s. He wore a formal kimono, his hair neat, posture proud. But there was something off about his eyes. Not sadness, not pride, emptiness. As if even then he knew he would be forgotten. She flipped to another sheet, a brittle page that had been tucked behind the frame, a family record. Kazuo Shiba, died 1933. No spouse listed, no descendants. Ritual incomplete. Vessel rejected. Vessel. Ayaka's hands trembled. She turned to the window. Hiroshi was standing at the edge of the rice field again, whispering into the wind. But this time he wasn't alone. The clay figure stood beside him, taller now. It was no longer a lump with limbs. It had grown. Its proportions were wrong, stretched in places where a child should still be soft, but there was something deeply human trying to form beneath the clay. And in the light of the setting sun, Ayaka saw what had never been there before. A face. Not a full one, not yet, but enough. Eyes. Narrow, set deep beneath heavy brows. They matched the eyes in the photograph. Kazuo. Ayaka clutched the image to her chest as she stepped away from the window, heart pounding in her ears. He was coming back. Not as a memory, not as a spirit, but as a body.
one built from ash and grief, one sculpted by hands desperate for legacy, one fed by her silence and bound by her shape. The door creaked behind her. She turned. Hiroshi stood in the hallway, his head tilted, his lips curled slightly upward. "He likes the name," he whispered. Ayaka didn't speak. Not because she couldn't, but because she finally understood what the ritual had always been about. Not creating life, but recalling it. Not summoning a soul, but housing one. And she, by sculpting the shape, by laying it in her bed, by allowing it to rest beside her, had given it the invitation it needed. Kazuo was not a story. He was family. And now he had a face.
It began with the footprints. Ayaka noticed them first on the 10th morning, when the light through the shoji was still faint and silver. Small impressions in the tatami, still damp. She had wiped the floor clean the night before, every inch. She remembered because she'd done it with salt water and trembling hands. But now, the prints were back. Tiny, barefoot marks, circling the bed, not in random patterns, but in deliberate loops, perfect spirals. 1, 2, 3, always clockwise, always growing tighter. She followed them with her eyes, dread blooming slow and bitter in her chest. The final loop ended just beside her pillow. That day, she said nothing to Hiroshi, or the thing inside him. He moved through the house with strange rhythm, as if pulled by strings she couldn't see. He laughed more often now, but never at anything. And he had developed a new habit, speaking to empty corners, sometimes with warmth, like a father, sometimes with reverence, like a servant. Ayaka pretended not to notice. But at night, when she lay in bed, alone or not, she no longer knew. She felt breath against her neck. It was never warm, just moist, just present. She never turned her head to look. On the third night, she left a layer of salt across the doorway. By morning, it had been disturbed, not fully broken, but parted perfectly, as if a child's foot had gently stepped over the line. That evening, Ayaka waited until Hiroshi disappeared again, into the field, into the fog, and then crept back to the attic. She wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for proof that she hadn't gone mad. What she found instead was the wall. A section of the attic had been cleared. The dust had been brushed away, and in the center of the wooden floor, etched into the surface with the tip of a knife or a fingernail, was a perfect circle of kanji. Not words, not phrases, but characters repeating over and over again, carved in layers like prayer rings around a shrine. She knelt down, tracing them with her eyes. Kata, form. Modoru, return. Chi, blood. Sen, ancestor. Ware, I. Her hand trembled as she reached the center, where something had been placed carefully, deliberately. A single human tooth. Small, childlike, browned with age. She fled the attic. That night, the circle of muddy footprints expanded. Not just around the bed now, but throughout the house, into the kitchen, through the hallway, stopping at the kamidana, where offerings had begun to appear that she hadn't left. Pieces of rice, ash-blacked coins,
tiny pressed flowers. And the clay figure no longer stayed still. She never saw it move, but it was always closer, always wetter. Its skin had begun to crack, not from dryness, but from growth. Thin black lines crawled along its arms and neck like veins beneath clay. Its face was nearly formed now, eyes that didn't blink, a mouth that opened slightly when no one was watching. And one morning, she woke to find it lying between her and Hiroshi, one hand on his chest, the other curled gently in hers, as if it had chosen, as if it was done being shaped. The first time Ayaka saw the crack in Hiroshi's skin, she thought it was just mud, a smear on his neck, just above the collarbone, thin, dark, jagged, like dried clay from the figure had brushed against him in the night. She reached out, fingers grazing the edge of it, meaning to wipe it away, but his skin crumbled under her touch. Just a flake, no blood, no pain. He didn't even flinch. He only smiled, soft and empty. It's just old skin. He's giving me new ones. Ayaka didn't respond, because she had seen it now. The thing beneath the flaking skin wasn't flesh. It was the same color as the river clay, the same texture. She stepped back and said nothing. That night, Hiroshi didn't come to bed, but something else did. The figure, now the size of a young child, stood in the doorway just before dawn. Ayaka pretended to be asleep, her breath slow, measured, but her eyes were open, barely, just enough to see. It stood for a long time, watching. Then it stepped into the room. Each footstep was wet, not with water, but with something thicker, something that left a smear behind, like blood turned to paste. It climbed onto the futon slowly, deliberately, and lay down beside her. She could feel the heat from it now, real body heat and breath, slow, measured, mimicking hers, but slightly off, like it was still learning the rhythm. She didn't move, not until morning. When she sat up, the futon beside her was soaked through. The blanket smelled of ash and damp earth. There was a faint impression left in the pillow. A head had rested there, slightly too large for a child, but too small for a man. She got up and walked to the mirror. What she saw made her blood go cold. It wasn't her reflection. It looked like her, but older, hollowed, eyes sunken, mouth pale, hair wet with sweat. And standing just behind her, close, too close, was Hiroshi. Only it wasn't. The man in the reflection had his posture, his clothing, his smile, but not his face. The features were almost right, like a portrait drawn from memory by someone who had never seen him fully awake. The eyes were slightly too far apart, the cheekbones too flat, the smile too wide. She spun around. No one was behind her, but the scent lingered. Mud, clay, sweat. She stumbled out of the room and down the hallway. The house felt smaller now, the walls too close, the ceilings too low. She couldn't catch her breath. Every window was shut, every door swollen with moisture. And in the living room, she found Hiroshi. He was sitting perfectly still, staring at the blank wall. His hands rested on his knees. His skin was cracking in long lines, like something inside was pushing outward. "Do you see him yet?" he asked, without turning. Ayaka's voice broke. "See who?" He looked over his shoulder, and for a moment she saw two faces, one overlaying the other, his and another, older, angular, leering with the innocence of something reborn without mercy.
Me, the voice said. But it didn't come from Hiroshi's mouth. It came from the figure that stepped out of the shadows beside him. The child was fully formed now, and the face it wore was no longer blank. It was Kazuo's.
Ayaka left the house that morning without shoes. She didn't remember deciding to. She didn't remember picking a direction. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her down the narrow village paths, past houses long since empty, past shrines smothered in ivy, toward something, someone she hadn't yet allowed herself to seek. She stopped in front of the last house still inhabited, the midwife, old Tsuno. She had lived at the far edge of Tsujino for decades, long after the rest of the families moved to the cities or fled the valley. Whispers followed her like a second shadow, whispers of rituals she'd helped perform, births she had guided, and bodies she had wrapped in silence. Hiroshi once said she had no children of her own, but Ayaka had always sensed she carried the weight of many. Ayaka knocked 3 times. The door opened on its own. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from dried herbs. Bundles of leaves hung from the rafters, the walls lined with cracked jars and faded scrolls. Old Tsuno sat at the hearth, her eyes already waiting. "You brought him back," the old woman said, before Ayaka could speak. Ayaka didn't answer. She didn't need to. "He was the first," Tsuno murmured, stirring something that steamed and hissed. "Kazuo Shiba died too young, without a son. The elders feared the bloodline would end, so his widow, she shaped a vessel." Ayaka sat, legs folded tightly beneath her. But the soul that came was not meant to return. He had not crossed peacefully. He had been angry, bitter, left with no name on any headstone, no offerings at the shrine. And when he came, he stayed, in ways no one could control. Her voice dropped lower. The clay softened, the child breathed, and on the 7th night, she died. Ayaka's throat closed. She died? Tsuno nodded slowly. Beside the things she made, it took what it needed: warmth, voice, memory. It was never truly human, but it wore the shape, and it wanted more. Ayaka's hand shook. Why didn't anyone stop her? "We did," Tsuno said. "We forbade the ritual. We buried the basin. We burned the records." "But I found them," Ayaka whispered. "And that is the nature of grief. It survives the fire." Ayaka looked down, her voice breaking. "He speaks through my husband. Sometimes I don't know who's talking. Sometimes it's both. I think it's learning to be him." Tsuno stared into the flames. "If the soul binds too deep, the host will fade. The voice will merge. One body, 2 mouths. And then the vessel will no longer need clay." Ayaka looked up sharply. "You mean it can stay?" "If you name it, it becomes real." Ayaka's breath caught. "I haven't named him. I never did." "But your husband did," Tsuno replied gently. "He said it aloud, and the earth heard." The room was spinning. Ayaka felt the words pressing against her skin like weight. Every night, every whisper, every soft giggle in the walls, she had let it happen. She had shaped the door. "What do I do now?" she asked. Tsuno was quiet for a long time. Then she reached beneath the hearth and pulled out a thin knife. The blade was chipped, old, stained. She laid it in Ayaka's hands.
You sever clay by cutting the shape it remembers. Ayaka stared at it. You must unmake him, Suna whispered, before he chooses a new womb. Ayaka stood, and outside the wind changed, as if something far away had heard every word.
The 13th night began with stillness. No wind, no breath of sound, no frogs croaking from the flooded fields. Even the insects held their tongues. Ayaka stood at the edge of the rice field, barefoot, clutching the old midwife's knife in both hands. Her fingers were numb, but not from the cold. The numbness was deeper. It lived in her bones now, a quiet resolve, carved from fear that had long since stopped screaming. The moon hung low, smeared in cloud. Its light was enough to see the path, the one Hiroshi always took when he disappeared after dark. She followed it now, her feet sinking slightly into the damp earth, her heartbeat like thunder trapped in clay. She reached the clearing where the rice gave way to a shallow pool of water. There she saw them, Hiroshi and the child. They stood side by side, motionless, reflections broken by soft ripples. Hiroshi's arms hung loosely by his sides, his head tilted slightly toward the child, who no longer looked like a child at all. The clay figure had grown. Its face was no longer soft and shapeless. It bore the features of a man, not young, not old. Eyes deep and knowing, as if remembering lives it had never lived. Cheekbones sharp, lips full and cracked. And in the dim moonlight, Ayaka could see that its skin, if it could be called that, had begun to tighten, hardening, drying, becoming permanent. She stepped into the water. The mud pulled at her ankles like pleading hands, but she kept walking, each step a prayer, each breath a plea. Hiroshi turned first. His smile was hollow, empty of recognition. "You came," he said, but the voice was no longer his. It was deeper now, layered. Hiroshi's tone mixed with something older, something colder, the voice of a man who had waited too long beneath the earth. The figure looked at her, head tilting in mimicry. Its mouth opened slowly. "Mother," it said. Ayaka froze. That word. It was never hers to hear. "You're not my child," she said softly. The thing's expression twisted, not into anger, but into something far more dangerous. Need. I was promised shape. I was promised breath. Ayaka stepped forward, lifting the knife. "I never gave you a name. You gave me a body. That was enough." Behind it, in the water, something moved. Ayaka looked closer. Shapes. Dozens of them, broken pieces of other clay children, half sunken in the mud, arms, legs, faces with mouths open in silent screams, all abandoned, all incomplete, all watching. "You were not the first," Kazuo said. Ayaka raised the blade. "You will be the last." But the figure only stepped toward her. Hiroshi followed. His eyes were glazed, distant. His body moved like it no longer belonged to him. Kazuo reached out. "Let me live," he said. "I can be yours." Ayaka's hands trembled. She saw flashes, her husband laughing beside her, dreams of a family, hopes buried in hospital test results and whispered apologies. For a moment, the thing before her almost looked like what she once wanted, but it wasn't. It never was. She screamed and lunged forward, plunging the blade into the figure's chest. The sound it made was not human. It wasn't even pain.
It was shock, disbelief, a gasp like the collapse of a tomb. The clay cracked beneath the knife. A splinter shot down its torso. Its limbs twitched violently. Hiroshi collapsed beside it, convulsing in the shallow water. Ayaka pulled the blade free. Kazuo fell. No blood, just steam, just ash. The figure crumbled inward, mouth open, eyes wide, as if trying to hold shape one last time. Then it shattered into blackened clay, hollow, silent, dead. Ayaka fell to her knees, gasping. Hiroshi lay beside her, unmoving. And in the windless night, the other broken figures in the mud finally dissolved, one by one, until the field was just a field again. But the water stayed dark.
The days that followed were not days at all. Time became water, thick, sluggish, impossible to grasp. Ayaka wandered through the house as if moving through the ruins of something sacred and broken. Every floorboard moaned beneath her feet. Every shadow carried the echo of small, wet footsteps. The shattered figure had vanished into dust and mud, but its presence clung to the walls. It was not gone. It had only returned to where it was born. Hiroshi remained in bed. He had not spoken since the 13th night. He barely moved. His body was warm, but his eyes stared through her, blank as unpainted dolls. Ayaka wiped the sweat from his face. She whispered to him, touched his cheek, begged for signs of the man she loved. But it wasn't until she touched his chest that she realized something was wrong. Beneath the skin, just under the ribs, she felt it, something hard. Not bone, not muscle. Something smooth, foreign, shaped. She pressed gently, and it moved. Ayaka jerked back, breath caught in her throat. She stared at her husband's body and felt the terror bloom anew, not wild like before, but cold and creeping, the way rot spreads under floorboards, silent, sure. Later that night, she stood at the mirror, peeling off her clothes to bathe. And that was when she saw it. Her belly, it had grown. Not distended like pregnancy, but taut, rounded, too quickly, too unnaturally. She touched it, her hands shaking. The surface pulsed once, not with life, with memory. She collapsed to her knees, nausea rising in her throat. It wasn't possible. She had never been pregnant, never conceived. The hospital records were clear. But this wasn't life. This was the remainder of a ritual not yet complete. Something had stayed behind. Something had moved from clay to blood, from mud to marrow. She crawled to the kitchen, tore open the drawers, and grabbed a paring knife. She stared at her reflection in the blade, at the eyes that no longer looked like hers. Then she laid the knife against her stomach. But the moment metal kissed skin, the house groaned, deep and long, like the earth warning her to stop. The lights flickered, the walls breathed, and from somewhere in the house came a sound she would never forget. A child's voice, but not from a mouth. It came from within her, muffled, wet, and it spoke one word: again. She dropped the knife, stumbled backward, collapsed. The candle in the corner snuffed out. The shadows lengthened. And in the dark, her womb whispered back. Ayaka waited until nightfall. Not because it was safer, but because rituals always began in the dark. She stood in the center of the bedroom with the old basin beside her, the one she had found in the attic all those weeks ago. It was empty now, but the clay still clung to its sides like something alive. The rim was warm, it had never cooled. The house was silent. Hiroshi hadn't stirred since morning. He remained in the futon, eyes open, mouth closed, skin pale and splitting in places where veins had turned the color of soil. He didn't speak anymore, not with his own voice, only when it wanted to. Ayaka opened the drawer of the kamidana, pulling out the old scrolls, the faded ritual pages she had once studied with curiosity and fear. Now she read them with clarity, with understanding born not of tradition, but of consequence. There was no instruction for undoing the ritual, but there was a warning. If the vessel is filled and left unbroken, the seed will root in the living, and clay will crave clay. She now knew what that meant. The figure was broken, but not before it had passed something into her. And now it was growing. She could feel it, pressing outward against her womb, anchoring itself into her blood. It was not a child. It was not a spirit. It was the remainder of Kazuo, the part too stubborn to vanish, too ancient to forget. He had failed to live in clay, so he chose flesh. She dragged the basin into the center of the room, scooped earth from outside, mixed it with ash from the shrine. This time, there would be no shaping, only unmaking. She stripped the sheets from the bed, poured salt in a wide circle, lit candles in every corner of the room, each flame flickering with hesitation. Then she knelt before the basin and began to whisper, not prayers, but apologies. I didn't know what I was calling. I didn't know what would answer. The air thickened. The walls pulsed. From the hallway came a slow, dragging sound, wet, uneven, a breath that didn't belong to anyone still fully alive. She ignored it. She reached for the knife, drew the edge gently across her palm, let the blood fall into the clay, mixed it, not to give shape, but to reclaim it. She placed her blood back into the earth, back into what she had stolen. The door creaked open. Hiroshi entered, but it wasn't him. His body was wrong, twisted, elongated, one arm longer than the other, his face slack and smiling, as if still wearing a mask that didn't quite fit, and beneath his skin, the clay moved. He stepped toward her, silent. She held up the knife. "You're not my husband." He tilted his head. "You brought me here." Ayaka's voice trembled. "I brought something. I didn't know it was you. You shaped me, and now I live in both of you." She backed toward the basin. "If I unmake the shape, you lose your place, but not my memory," it whispered. She raised the knife again, but this time turned it toward herself. "I'll cut you out of me. I'll carve the seed from where you planted it." The thing inside Hiroshi paused. For the first time, it looked afraid. Ayaka pressed the blade to her skin, and then a voice not hers, but from inside her belly, cried out, "Mother, don't!" It was soft, innocent, manipulative. She screamed and plunged her hand into the basin, pressing her bleeding palm into the clay, mixing it, spoiling it with living blood. The candles flared, the house shrieked, a gust of wind slammed every door at once. And then, silence. She opened her eyes. Hiroshi lay crumpled on the floor, unmoving. The basin had cracked down the middle. The clay was no longer warm. It was cold, heavy, still. Ayaka collapsed beside it, weeping, not from grief, not from fear, but from exhaustion, because something had stopped.
But something else had begun.
It rained for 3 days after the ritual. Not a soft cleansing rain, but a deluge, relentless, heavy. The kind of rain that felt like it came from beneath the ground, not above it. It turned the rice fields to black mirrors and flooded the low paths with muck so thick it swallowed footprints before they could be seen. Ayaka didn't sleep. She sat beside Hirashi's motionless body, wiping his face, whispering his name, waiting for something to return. Not the voice, not the smile, not the man who had once been her husband. Just breath, anything. But Hiroshi stayed cold. Not dead, not alive. Suspended. A shell in waiting. On the 3rd night of rain, Ayaka heard them. Footsteps. Not inside the house, but outside in the field. She crept to the window and pulled back the edge of the shoji screen. What she saw made her knees buckle. They were rising. Figures from the mud. Dozens of them. Half-formed, cracked, slumping but moving. Shaped but incomplete. Arms without joints. Legs with too many bends. Faces smooth and eyeless. Some were only torsos. Some crawled. All of them dripping with the same clay. Kazuo's clay. The cursed kind. She backed away, heart racing. The basin was gone, broken. She had ended the shape. She had unmade the child. But this was the graveyard. And now it had bloomed. She rushed to the storage shed and pulled what she could. Kerosene, old matches, torn rags. Her mind no longer questioned. It only remembered the stories, the whispers, the way the old midwife had said it with dread. We forbade the ritual. We buried the basin. We burned the records. Burned. Because fire was the only thing clay couldn't imitate. She soaked the hallway, the engawa, the outer walls. She whispered apologies to the ancestors and struck a match. The flame took quickly. The old wood was thirsty. The house screamed. She stood at the edge of the garden, rain pouring down her face, and watched it burn. Inside the flames, she saw shapes moving, crawling, pressing against the walls, faces against the paper, hands against the glass. None of them cried out. None of them begged. They just watched her. And behind them, she saw one final figure. Taller, sharper, fully formed. Kazuo. He stood in the heart of the house, wrapped in smoke, unmoving as the fire ate through the floor beneath him. Their eyes met, hers wide with fear, his hollow with betrayal. And then he was gone, swallowed by fire, by earth, by blood that no longer welcomed him. Ayaka collapsed to her knees. The rain extinguished the last embers by dawn. When she returned to where the house had stood, there was nothing left. Only ash, only mud, only silence. But in the flooded field, the water was still dark, still warm, still watching. The village was gone. What remained was soot. Ash where wood once stood. Scorched rice stalks waving in drowned silence. The Shiba family home was now only a blackened outline on the wet earth, as if it had been sketched in charcoal and then erased by rain. Smoke still curled weakly from the ruins, like breath from dying lungs. Ayaka stayed, not because she wanted to, because she couldn't leave.
Something held her there, part guilt, part fear, part unspoken duty. She lived now in the old storage hut near the edge of the property, sleeping on a woven mat, drinking rainwater, eating what little remained from the untouched fields. Hiroshi's body was buried beneath the stone markers behind the shrine, or at least the part of him that hadn't been clay. She wasn't sure which part had died, and which might still be listening. The days bled together. Sometimes she forgot what month it was. The rain never fully stopped. It came in long whispers, falling without sound, blurring the boundaries between sky and soil. And then came the voice, soft, from inside her. She had almost convinced herself it was gone, the thing that had rooted itself in her womb, curled like a parasite in the ritual's wake. She had bled for days after the fire, had watched as black clay passed from her body, cracking in water, dissolving into nothing. But she had never named it, and that was her last defense. She sat one night beneath the open eaves of the shrine, the candlelight flickering, casting shadows that danced along the wood like old memories. Her hand rested on her belly, flat now, silent, until it wasn't. A ripple, not of muscle, not of gas, a true ripple, a movement, followed by a whisper from inside. Mother, I don't want to be forgotten. Ayaka froze. She hadn't heard it in days, weeks, not since the fire. But now, it was back. You burned my body, the voice said, soft, as if pouting. But you never sent me away. You never spoke the name. I never gave you one, Ayaka whispered aloud. You shaped me. I never finished. You finished enough. She pressed both hands to her belly. You're gone. I saw it. I bled you out. The voice giggled. Not all of me. She could feel it now, not just inside, but around. The rain falling heavier, the trees leaning in, the land remembering. Clay does not forget its mold. Say my name, it urged. Let me be yours. No, she breathed. But part of her wanted to. That was the horror of it, not just fear, not just revulsion, longing. Some ancient ache in her chest stirred at the sound of it calling her mother. And the voice knew. You asked for me. You gave me shape. Now give me meaning. Ayaka stood, heart racing. She stepped out into the open, into the wet night where the field shimmered like an unblinking eye. She screamed into the wind, You are not mine! But the voice answered, I am. You made me. Even without a name, I grew. I lived. You are nothing. I am everything you wanted. Ayaka fell to her knees, sobbing. She did want something. A child, a legacy, a body to carry her love forward. But not like this. Not from clay. Not from grief. I will never speak your name, she whispered. And the voice fell silent. But the water in the fields rippled. And at the far edge, something stood, small, shaped, waiting. Ayaka awoke before the sun. The air was still. No wind, no rain, just a silence so deep it felt like a warning.
She wrapped herself in her old robe, now faded and frayed at the sleeves. Her feet found the cold earth with a practiced step. Every movement that morning had weight. Every breath felt rehearsed. She knew what she was going to do, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only thing left. In the shrine, she laid out what remained of the old ritual pages. Some were water damaged, others singed at the edges, but the ink had survived, and so had the meaning. If the soul does not release, offer it a new form. If the body will not let go, give it a shape to hold that is not flesh. She walked to the edge of the field and began to dig. Not deep, just enough. The earth was soft, black, eager. She pulled the last of the river clay from beneath the roots. It squelched in her hands like something alive. She mixed it in the old basin she had hidden from the fire, the only object she had saved, the one she swore never to use again. But this time, it wasn't to call, it was to contain. She brought the basin into the shrine, lit a candle, and sat before it, legs folded, hands trembling. Then she began to shape. But this time, it wasn't a child. It was herself. Not exact, not perfect, but close enough. Her hands moved without thought, mimicking the slope of her own shoulders, the shape of her lips, the curve of her jaw. She pressed her fingerprints into the clay's skin, one by one. She carved shallow indentations for eyes, closed. She left the mouth sealed shut. No name, no voice, only form. When it was finished, she sat back and wept. Not from fear, from sorrow, because this was her. This was what she had become, a vessel, hollowed out, ready to hold something that didn't belong. She placed the figure in the center of the room, surrounded it with salt, and waited. Night fell. The moon rose veiled in mist, and then the voice came again, inside her, faint, resigned. Is this for me? She nodded, though no one could see her. I want to go home, it whispered. You can't have mine, she said, but I need to stay. She touched the clay figure's chest with her own bleeding hand, pressed her palm against its heart. Then take this, she said. Shape yourself here. Sleep here. The voice was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, thank you. The wind howled outside. The candles blew out. The earth beneath the shrine groaned, and Ayaka felt it, something pull from inside her. Not pain, not terror, a release, like breath exhaled for the first time in years. The clay figure shifted, cracked, and then stillness. Ayaka collapsed. The room was dark again. When she woke, it was morning. Light poured through the slats. Birds chirped faintly, and the figure sat exactly where she had left it, lifeless, dry, unmoving. Inside it, she knew, was everything Kazuo had been, all the sorrow, all the want, all the twisted fragments of soul that had clung to her blood, sealed, contained, silent. She buried the figure that afternoon in the center of the field. No marker, no name, just dirt, just peace. And for the first time in weeks, Ayaka walked back into the empty shrine and heard nothing at all. It had been 7 days since she buried the figure. 7 days of stillness, of silence. The birds had returned to the trees, the frogs to the edges of the field. Even the wind sounded natural again, brushing across the tall grass without whispering names.
Ayaka slept, truly slept, for the first time since the ritual. Her dreams were empty, blessedly blank. No children's voices, no wet footprints, no rising shapes. And yet, on the 8th morning, she woke to damp sheets. The smell hit her first. Wet soil, river clay. Not strong, just faint enough to question. She sat up slowly, her body stiff. The futon was soaked on one side, as if someone had lain beside her, sweating earth. She checked the roof. No leaks. The window was closed. The floor was clean, but the dampness remained. And then she saw it, pressed into the pillow beside hers, the shallow curve of a head. Too small to be hers, too recent to be memory. She got up. Her knees shook. She stripped the bed, carried the sheets outside, and scrubbed them until her knuckles ached. The mud didn't come out easily. It was too dark, too thick, clay soaked with something old. That night, she did not sleep. She watched the window, listened to the wind, waited for the sound of breathing that was not her own. But nothing came. No voices, no laughter. Only the house, creaking like normal houses do. She told herself it was over. She repeated it like a prayer. Over, over, over. But on the 10th day, something new appeared. By the front door, a single object, small, round. Ayaka bent down and picked it up. It was hard between her fingers, smooth, warm from the sun. At first, she thought it was a pebble, but when she brushed away the dirt clinging to its side, she saw what it truly was. A tooth, tiny, child-sized, fired in clay. She dropped it, stepped back, stared at it like it might hatch, because she knew what it meant. The body had been buried, the vessel sealed, but something had remembered her, and it was leaving pieces behind. Ayaka moved to the city 1 month later. She left quietly, without ceremony. No goodbye to the village, no prayers left at the broken shrine. Just a single suitcase, a silent walk to the nearest train station, and a ticket to anywhere not carved from soil and shadow. She found a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a concrete building in a neighborhood with bright lights and noisy neighbors. It was the kind of place where no one knew each other's names, where no one asked questions, where nothing from the earth could follow, only people, and people could be outrun. For a while, it worked. She bought new clothes, cut her hair, started sketching again. Simple things at first, plants, rooftops, city corners. Her hands no longer trembled. Her voice returned. She even laughed once, out loud, and the sound startled her. Time passed, and then one morning she vomited. At first she thought it was the flu. Then it happened again, and again. She took the test. Positive. Ayaka sat in her bathroom for over an hour, staring at the tiny pink line, her heart hollow and echoing. She hadn't touched anyone since Hiroshi, since the night she ended the ritual, since she buried the clay figure in the flooded rice field with no name and no prayer. It wasn't possible. Not unless... Her hand dropped to her belly. It felt normal. Warm, quiet, but she knew better. She made an appointment. At the clinic, she didn't ask for confirmation. She asked for an ultrasound. The nurse smiled. "Already protective, huh? It's still early, but let's take a look." Ayaka lay back on the table, her pulse pounding through her wrists. The technician pressed the cold wand to her stomach. The screen flickered. Static. Then, movement. "There we go," the nurse said softly. "Just one. Healthy heartbeat." A tiny shape appeared on the screen. Curled. New. Still forming. Ayaka stared. And then, a flicker. Too fast. Too deliberate. The figure on the screen moved. A hand rose, and for the briefest second, it pressed itself against the inside of the womb, palm first, like clay remembering the warmth of fingers. Ayaka couldn't breathe. The nurse tilted her head. "Are you okay?" Ayaka nodded slowly, eyes still locked on the screen. "Yes," she whispered, but her voice was distant. Her mind miles away, in a village forgotten by time, in a house swallowed by fire, in a field where things rose from mud, begging for shape. The nurse smiled. "Would you like a copy of the image?" Ayaka shook her head. "No." She left the clinic in silence, and that night, as she lay in bed, rain tapping gently at the window, she felt it again. A small shift, a ripple, a memory, and a voice, barely audible, barely real, spoken not aloud, but from somewhere deeper. "I waited."